Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our ABA panel on Islamophobia after the Muslim ban. We'll begin in a few moments as we have participants joining us. Great, it looks like we have a number of people joining, and we're really excited to share this rapid response panel entitled Islamophobia After the Muslim Ban. Welcome and thank you for joining us. This is a panel sponsored by the ABA section of Civil Rights and Social Justice. This panel is a part of a series of rapid response webinars on critical legal issues of criminal justice, civil rights, human rights, and economic concerns, to name a few. We're actively planning additional programming on a variety of issues, so please check americanbar.org/CRSJ for additional updates on additional programs. And during today's program, we encourage you to ask questions of our panelists through the Q&A. Please note that's not the chat function, it's the Q&A. And if you don't see those controls, please ensure that your screen is not idle. We will look forward to hearing from our panelists and then address questions at the end of the discussion. We'll also be sharing a recording of the program to everyone who is registered so that you can share it widely with your networks. And with that, we are thrilled to begin our program today entitled Islamophobia After the Muslim Ban. Today's program is co-sponsored by the Council on American-Islamic Relations, CARE, and the National Association of Muslim Lawyers. This program today will explore the direct impact on the American Muslim community following the signing of the executive order banning individuals from Muslim-majority countries from entering the United States. Included in the discussion will be reference to litigation across the country concerning the ban, statistics around increased incidents of Islamophobia following the order, and personal accounts of individuals and families directly impacted by the ban. Our panelists today are Engy Abdelkader, Edward Ahmed Mitchell, Ashraf Nubani, Mehwish Shaukat, and Saleema Snow. I'm your moderator, and I'm so honored to be moderating this esteemed panel. I'm Rula Alouche, an attorney at Graydon Law in Cincinnati, Ohio. I'm also the National Board Chair of the Council on American-Islamic Relations, and I serve on the Council of the ABA section of Civil Rights and Social Justice, also serving on our Bullyproof Committee. Our first speaker today is Ashraf Nubani, who's an attorney at AWN Point Law. With over 20 years of legal experience, Mr. Nubani has taken on some of the most difficult cases of the 21st century, ranging from denial of citizenship applications to terrorism cases. His diverse array of practice areas has made him a sought-after attorney for those in need of legal services in a post-9/11 world. He's been doing this work since he was a student at the Indiana University School of Law, and we look forward to hearing from him share with us today some of the pre-issues leading up to the Muslim ban. Ashraf?
Okay, yes, thank you for that introduction. Just a disclaimer that the intro about me was probably from a marketing blurb. I want to start by giving a brief selective brief historical survey about Islam historically speaking. I have a master's in history, and I just want to put that out there so that we're not just focusing on what's happening today, but to have an idea of the origins. And this is because I think that it's ignored or it's neglected as irrelevant and sometimes a taboo. And so I want to do that in order to elucidate some of the things that we will hear today. The nature of Islamophobia goes back with the advent of Islam. When it appeared in the 7th century AD, it was viewed as a heretical offshoot of Christianity. But as it became dominant in the region, it was then looked at as a heathenistic religion, and Prophet Muhammad was viewed as a false prophet and someone who was inspired by Satan. And so that kind of sets the backdrop, and this continued until it culminated with the Crusades in from the 11th centuries to the 13th centuries AD. And after the Ottoman Empire, after the Crusade period, the Ottoman Empire, the Turks became dominant in the region, and there was a continuous competition between the the West and the East vying for power. And at one point, the Ottomans reached Austria, the gates of Vienna in the 1600s. So there was a lot of there was contentious moments in history between Islam and the West. And with the fall of the Ottoman Empire, it culminated with, or during that period in the last centuries of the fall of the Ottoman Empire, which lasted about 700 years. In the waning part of the Ottoman Empire, the European countries became dominant in terms of imperialism and colonialism in the Muslim world. And that also was another facet to the tension. Now, I don't believe in a clash of civilizations, but this is sort of this is the historical backdrop. And I think in one important book that people who have the time and ability to read would be Orientalism by Edward Said, which put this in context of how the West views Islam or how Western scholars view Islam. And he said it was intertwined with the dominance of the West over Islam, and therefore the portrayal of the East, which is the Orient, meaning the Middle East, North Africa, and parts of Asia, as being backward, violent, not able to assimilate to Western liberal thought or democracy. And America kind of carried on that mantle. Bush, for example, Bush Jr., when he was president, one of his advisors was Bernard Lewis, who was an Orientalist. He passed away. He was over 100 years when he passed away just a few years ago. But he was a formidable scholar. But his views on Islam on the East that shaped the views of policymakers in the U.S. So. That's just basically the history. I just wanted to throw it out there because I think, as I said, it's oftentimes neglected when we talk about Islamophobia or the Muslim ban here and now. This kind of gives that backdrop. The other part of what I wanted to discuss was my experiences as an attorney with Islamophobia and what culminated in the Muslim ban, and is obviously continuing, is it really began for me in the early 90s with there was a book by Steve Emerson called Jihad in America, and it was an attempt to portray Muslim organizations and activists as these people who were trying to infiltrate American society in order to promote their violent agenda. And after that, of course, we had the first World Trade Center bombing, and I was still in law school at the time at Indiana University, Bloomington, and I clerked for Kunstler and Kubi. Kunstler was many of you may know him or should have heard of him. He represented the Chicago 7 in the 1968 Democratic Convention riots. He represented those defendants, or at least some of them, in that trial. And he was representing Sheikh Omar Abdurrahman, who was a blind Egyptian cleric who had come to the United States, and he had said, some very provocative things, but ended up being charged with things that weren't connected to what he did. He was blind, yet he was initially charged with handling bomb-making materials. So it was a conspiracy that was kind of set up, but it was the backdrop for this demonization of Muslims that had a long history previous to that. So I clerked for Kunstler when they were representing him, and I had an opportunity to meet him and others who were in jail. And the judge at the time, Mukasey, who later became Attorney General, was the sitting judge on the case. He happened to be a Jewish American and contributed to a Shiva and was supportive of the settlement project in Israel. And when Kunstler, who was also Jewish, brought that up in a motion to have him recused, he refused to be recused, and he later sat as the presiding judge over the trial of Umar Abdurrahman and other defendants, and he was the one to sentence them. So that was sort of like the first experience that I had. Of course, with the Oklahoma City bombing in 1995, and at that time, Steve Emerson was making the rounds, saying that Islam is by nature is violent, and these Muslims who you may perceive them to be as docile or your next door neighbor, but they could be doing this. And I've been following those cases throughout that period of time. And this continued obviously until 9/11. And so when 9/11 came along in the Patriot Act, it wasn't passed in a vacuum. There was already a lot of preparation for those regulations in the guise of security, but it ended up focusing mostly on Muslims. The pre-Muslim ban, really, that people don't think about much, but it received some attention after 9/11, was NSEERS in the immigration regulations at the time. Ashcroft in 2002 implemented the NSEERS program, which was the registration system that required non-citizens who were currently in the United States and to register at their local ICE office. And this was like devastating to the community because I was an immigration attorney at the time and still am. And people just, those who obviously were out of status knew that they would be deported. Others didn't hear about it. Just families were broken up. I remember going to the local office in Arlington, where the Immigration Services was at the time, and it was on a Friday, and people had to come in and register, and it was time for Jum'ah, and there were like 50 Muslims, male Muslims, and it was mostly males, by the way, 50 male Muslims, and I think it was, I believe. I don't remember. I didn't register any females, and I think it was just geared towards males at the time. But there were 50 male Muslims in there who couldn't pray. So I asked at the time the director there if we could use space, and we had Jum'ah prayer, like probably for the first time ever in that place, and probably the last time. But people were telling me their stories of what was happening to them, how they were going to respond, what they needed to do. It was, it was a really difficult time. And then that continued, of course, in the representation of prosecutions against Muslims after 9/11. And while some of them, where they say where there's smoke, there's fire. A lot of these were what we term as entrapment cases, even though none of them or very few of them went to trial and they were able to put up that defense of entrapment. A lot of them were part of the security apparatus of taking vulnerable Muslims and using informants to bring them to a point where they could be arrested and the case would be touted as a prevention of terrorism. But it really wasn't, and because in many cases the money, the bombs that were of course inoperable, or weapons were inoperable, were provided by the FBI informant, and so that's part of the experiences that I had as an attorney in seeing these cases. So I guess I'll just stop it there because I think that there's a lot there to help with the introduction to talking about the Muslim ban. I will say that so Trump's Muslim ban, if we want to look at it in context, because he was a showman, he was able to solidify to his base in the American public the policies and the laws and the regulations that had already been in place long before he came. But in his characteristic, he said that I think Islam hates us, and I think that was there was no precedent for that before, but that was tone that he set for his administration. So I think I'll stop at there, and hopefully if there are questions at the end, we can entertain those.
Thank you, Mr. Nubani. Our next speaker is Professor Saleema Snow, who's a professor of law at the University of the District of Columbia David A. Clarke School of Law. She teaches perspectives on social justice and various legal writing courses. Professor Snow is currently president of the National Association of Muslim Lawyers. She's also past president of Karama, Muslim Women Lawyers for Human Rights, supporting the rights of Muslim women and children. In the face of the Trump administration's travel ban denying entry to persons from 6 Muslim-majority countries, Professor Snow supported the filing of an amicus brief on behalf of Karama in the United States Supreme Court case Trump versus Hawaii. Professor Snow, we look forward to hearing from you. Please unmute.
I had someone decided to mow their lawn just as we started, so I wanted to make sure I muted. So thank you so much. So if we reflect back on Friday, January 27, 2017, virtually every Muslim lawyer I knew was getting calls and text messages in the middle of the night about someone who was barred entry into the US, trapped at an airport, or just trying to get clarification on the scope of the Muslim ban. Saturday morning, I was in New York at the National Association of Muslim Lawyers strategic meeting. Initially, we had planned that meeting to address emerging policies of the new administration. So needless to say, with over 150 Muslim lawyers in the same space, the day after the Muslim ban, that meeting took on a new life. So for some, our actions included going to Kennedy Airport to support and advocate for those detained. Others rushed to Federal District Court in Brooklyn, waiting for Judge Donnelly's ruling in the ACLU's temporary restraining order. At approximately 8:45 p.m., Judge Donnelly granted a stay, preventing the government from deporting some arrivals. We didn't know what that really meant at that time, but it just felt like such a small victory that warranted some celebration. So we're here now almost 4 years later, and despite coordinated advocacy, despite subsequent well-crafted litigation, that original Muslim ban has expanded from 7 Muslim majority countries on January 27th, 2017, to now 13 countries with Muslim and African populations. I think it's often easier for us as lawyers to understand the legal timeline that brought us to this point, but it's a point where the Supreme Court in Trump v. Hawaii legitimized discrimination based on ethnicity, race, and religion. Justice Sotomayor began her dissent in Trump v. Hawaii with a sentence that focused on what she referenced as our nation's deep commitment to religious plurality and tolerance. Her dissent, I think in many ways, gave us hope. At least there was someone on that in the bench and who really understood and recognized and acknowledged that, in her words, the government involved in ill-defined national security threat to justify an exclusionary policy of sweeping proportion. So it has indeed been sweeping proportion. And it is that sweeping proportion that makes it so appropriate. I was so excited that the civil rights section was actually sponsoring this particular panel, because it reminds us that the Muslim ban sweeps deeply into various pockets and various communities, including the Black community. So I wanted to briefly talk about intersectional Islamophobia and how that intersectional Islamophobia has influenced, I think, in many ways that the Muslim ban has gained so much traction. So depending on the statistics that you adopt, 30% of American Muslims are Black Muslims, with half of those being African American. The legal implications of that Black invisibility when we're having this conversation about the Muslim ban is that we overlook that this is really often also about anti-Blackness. So if we're looking at, even since we actually whether it's the actual inauguration of the new administration or the actual Muslim ban. I am not a empirical, someone who has expertise in empirical data necessarily. So that ban took place, I think, 2 weeks after the current administration was in office. So I'm not going to really split hairs here. But what I will mention that during this administration, enforcement policies and rates of removal for Black Muslims have escalated. In the 11th Circuit's Ibrahim v. Acosta, attorneys are challenging the due process protections for their clients as relates to removal proceedings, but they are also bringing to light that Somali immigrants have had the highest immigration arrest rate under the Trump administration. Some have actually analogized the unfettered immigration enforcement and the Fugitive Slave Act. So another significant racial effect of the Muslim ban is that, Muslim ban in its various iterations, I should say, which I include the African ban as a part of that, 25% of African population is banned from entry into the United States. 25% of the African population is banned from entry into the United States. So we have to begin to, again, think about the apparent and increasing Blackness, anti-Blackness that the Muslim ban actually carries with it. So needless to say, we have always had an immigration system that benefited white European migration. Even with the 1965 INA eliminating the quota system of the Immigration Act of 1924, the INA never became the great equalizer for groups denied entry to this country because of race, because of ethnicity, or because of religion. And we have not equalized the freedom of travel for people coming from Africa or Black migration in general. In fact, I think even in this country, if we think about freedom of movement, Black people in this country are struggling with freedom of movement, a point that the Black Lives Matter has made apparent when you think about people walking the streets and being fearful that they won't make it home, not because of random violence, but because of police action. So freedom of movement is something that has consistently hindered Muslims within the Muslim ban, but it also is something that has hindered Black Muslims who are already in this country, and those who are threatened of removal procedure because they are Black and because they are Muslim. Just a bit of a personal context. I grew up in an area of Boston called Mattapan, and it was during a time when mandatory busing was first implemented. We were one of 2 Black families in our neighborhood, and our white neighbors regularly cut our clothesline, threw eggs at my mother. And I often think this is the most horrific part, that adults were calling me as a young child the N-word. A few days after September 11th, when I dropped my son off at school, a high school student yelled at me that he would kill me. At that time, I wore what some would define as traditional hijab. And there were many more comments that continued after that. Many of my Muslim friends were victims of various attacks and religious epithets. And I reflect on these experiences because in some ways, little seems to have changed for Black Muslims in this country with the Muslim ban. But what has really important that we take away is that the human toll has been deepened. And we all somewhat understand the rights that have been abrogated with the Muslim ban, but I often also think that it's important that we understand the human toll that has been deepened for communities that are already traumatized. The individual stories that we all have is important, but I often think that it is our collective voices that will serve to erode the deeply embedded discriminatory practices. I think we could all agree that we're in a highly politicized anti-Islam, anti-Blackness era, and that it has often been ally building that has kind of taken us out of the rut that we see in politics, in the courts as well. Courts that have often been very slow moving to give us justice that we are often are looking for. Something that Ashraf mentioned, that giving context, not being able to assimilate. This idea of giving context to how we even got to the point of having a Muslim ban is so critical, because it is how we frame Blackness, how we frame Muslims, that allows the courts to buy into security facade that somehow Black people are dangerous, that somehow Muslims are terrorists. We had the whole movement with the super predators of Black youth in New York, a super predator frame that continues to associate Blackness with crime. We have a foreign intruder terrorism frame that continues to be associated with Muslims, which gave meat to this government, this administration, going before the US Supreme Court in Trump v. Hawaii to support that there was somehow a security threat, because we have consistently framed Muslims, whether it's through NSEERS, whether it's through CVE, whether it's through the Patriot Act, we have consistently framed Muslims as being foreign intruders who are somehow a threat to our well-being, a threat to our well-being when it comes to how we perceive ourselves as a nation. So I do want to say that it's interesting when Justice Sonia Sotomayor mentioned in Trump v. Hawaii, she begins that dissent talking about pluralism and as a country being such an important value to us as a country. But really our Constitution was never designed to include people who look like me. Our founding fathers neither look like my father nor my mother. We have a Constitution that began on the premise that Black people are cargo, that women are the property of their husbands, that neither Catholics or Jews or Muslims, we weren't even contemplated as having religious freedom when it came to that document. So when we talk about religious pluralism, which Justice Sotomayor raises in the opening of her dissent, we also have to think about that it has been that debate of religious pluralism, how that looks to us versus nationalism, and how we are framing who has the right to be here, who has the right to be in America and assimilating as a so-called American. So I appreciate the context that Ashraf gave to know that how important it is for us to think about how did we get to this point? How did we get to the point where the United States Supreme Court legitimizes discriminating against based on religion, based on ethnicity, based on race, I will add, under this umbrella of somehow national security? It's because we have always thought of Black people and Muslims as being a security threat in many ways. So I will stop there and just remind us all that part of moving out of this Muslim ban, and let's see with Joe Biden lives up to his promise to end the Muslim ban, and whether it'll reappear in a different formation, such as CVE or NSEER. But part of moving out of repressive executive orders and statutes such as the Patriot Act means that we have to ensure that we are no longer being framed as Muslims being someone who is a foreign intruder aligned with terrorism, that Black people are not prone to crime. So much of this, I think, is grounded in how we frame who we are as members of this community.
Thank you, Professor Snow. Our next speaker is Edward Ahmed Mitchell. Mr. Mitchell is an attorney and former journalist who serves as the Deputy Director of the Council on American-Islamic Relations, the nation's largest civil rights and advocacy group for the American Muslim community. Mr. Mitchell previously served as the Executive Director of CARE Georgia from 2016 to 2020. And in 2016, his chapter received CARE National's Chapter of the Year Award. Before joining CARE Georgia, Mr. Mitchell practiced law as a criminal prosecutor for the city of Atlanta, also working as a freelance journalist for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. He has served as secretary of the National Association of Muslim Lawyers and an editor of Atlanta Muslim. He's a 2009 graduate of Morehouse College and a 2012 graduate of Georgetown University Law Center. He's my friend and colleague at CARE. Mr. Mitchell, we look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you so much, Rula, and good morning and assalamu alaikum to everyone. Let me start by saying thank you to the American Bar Association, to Namal, and to my colleagues at CARE for arranging this event. It turned out to be incredibly timely, given the changes we might see in relation to the Muslim ban in just a few months. So I'm very happy to be here with you. During my presentation, I want to start by giving a bit of a history, as some of the other speakers have done, but maybe with a little more detail about what led up to the Muslim ban. I'd then like to talk about the human impact of the ban, some of the things that I personally experienced dealing with clients impacted by the ban, and that CARE experienced dealing with people impacted by the ban. And then I'd like to discuss the future. What happens if the ban does indeed go away in January? That does not solve Islamophobia. It probably doesn't even reduce it. It just perhaps changes it. So those are the three things I want to go through, hopefully briefly, inshallah. So I'm going to try to share my screen. We'll see if the technology cooperates. Nothing has gone wrong so far. And usually something goes wrong at least once. So let's see, inshallah. All right, Rula, can you see my screen?
We can see your screen, Edward.
Okay, let's try to go full screen. All right, can you see now just the presentation itself?
Yep, we're good. Okay.
Alhamdulillah. All right. So, the first thing I like to do whenever I talk about Islamophobia is to note that anti-Muslim bigotry, while it's, new insofar as it's a unique form of bigotry, religious bigotry in America is hardly new. And actually, if you go back and look at American history, you can see that what Muslims are experiencing today, what the things that are said about Muslims were said about religious communities before us, and in some cases done to religious communities before us. For example, the Catholic community. Many of the things that are said about Muslims today were once said about Catholic Americans. They were immigrants. They were unwelcome. They were loyal to a foreign power. They couldn't be trusted. They were trying to take over and change our political system. This is a cartoon in the 1920s created by the KKK. And you see your Klansmen holding a bat named the ballot, a hairy, monstrous arm labeled Rome reaching down to grab the earth, America, and the KKK saying we're going to use the vote to defeat Catholic power. This was not a rare thing. This is a very common sentiment in America, anti-Catholic bigotry that manifested itself in anti-Catholic laws in the 1800s and the early 1900s. And it also led to violence. There's a Catholic priest who was murdered in Alabama for marrying a Protestant woman to a Catholic man. And then, of course, the Jewish community, it goes without saying, has experienced all manner of discrimination and bigotry, including in the United States. The Protocols of Zion were spread far and wide in America, including by Henry Ford of the Ford Company. And during World War II, Jewish refugees, as you all know, were turned away. Jewish refugees fleeing Europe were turned away. Much as you have Muslim refugees who've been fleeing Syria and other war zones, you had the Jewish community fleeing Europe. Many of them were sadly turned away and died in Europe. And so I say all this to note that this kind of hostility to refugees, indifference to refugees, hostility to religious minorities, this paranoia that religious minorities will take over America and change the American way of life and all this stuff, it's not really new. It's happened to other communities before us. So now jumping to the Muslim community. So before we can even say, the Muslim ban and talk about it, I guess the question is, how do we even get to a point where a president of the United States felt comfortable implementing a Muslim ban? How did we get to a point where so many of the American people would vote for a candidate who called for a complete shutdown of Muslims entering the United States? And so to understand that, we have to realize that the Muslim ban is essentially the crowning jewel of the Islamophobia movement. It was the pinnacle of what started earlier. So as a civil rights attorney, and I think Rula can attest to this, these are some of the major things we were experiencing with Islamophobia that led up to the Muslim ban. So number one, opposition to masjid projects. That is a mosque being built, local community, some get very angry, get very afraid, anti-Muslim hate groups come into the community and kick up all sorts of opposition to that mosque project. Quite common in various states, including so-called blue states. This is not something that only happened in the South or in red states. This happened all around the country, including in the state of Georgia, where I am based. This was an anti-Muslim protest held outside of a county building where a county was about to allow a Muslim cemetery to be built. They canceled that meeting because of fears of this armed protest. Another common thing, obviously, is mosques that are built being burned down. This has happened numerous times, and it happened numerous times in the 2000s in the wake of 9/11 and well after 9/11. Anti-Sharia hysteria, the conspiracy theory that Muslims want to impose Sharia on America, led to numerous states passing laws that either explicitly banned Sharia or banned foreign law based on this conspiracy theory. Employment discrimination was, and I dare say is still, the most common form of discrimination that we as CARE deal with when it comes to the Muslim community. This is a young woman who won her case against Abercrombie and Fitch at the Supreme Court several years ago after she was denied a job because of her hijab. Of course, violence against Muslims peaked, well, didn't peak, it sharply rose after 9/11, tapered off, and then steadily increased and increased and increased leading up to 2016. Perhaps the most disturbing incident we all know of was the murders of the 3 young students, our 3 winners in North Carolina, by their neighbor, an anti-Muslim and anti-religion bigot who shot them in their apartment. May Allah grant them paradise. Other incidents of harassment, highway harassment is quite common. This is an actual incident of someone targeting a Muslim couple, trying to run them off the road on a highway. School bullying, of course, very common, increasingly common. Muslims are most likely of all students to report experiencing bullying. Religious and racial profiling at the airport. Obviously, I know about driving while black. Muslims know about flying while Muslim. So, whether that's secondary screening when you're coming back into the country from overseas, whether it's going through TSA and going through these secondary security checks, numerous study after numerous study will show that Muslims experience this at a heightened level, especially visible Muslims. And of course, it's important to note, as was mentioned before, that the structure in our legal system to subject Muslim immigrants and Muslim citizens to enhanced vetting existed before the Muslim ban. NCERS was noted. That was a big example of this already that existed. And you could argue that this regulation, even though it ended in 2016 completely and was suspended in 2011 by the Obama administration, the skeleton of this was really used to create the Muslim ban. So I note all this to say these are some of the things that the Muslim community was dealing with that heightened Islamophobia in this country and eventually led to the Muslim ban. And you see this in the trends. Most people think that, anti-Muslim bigotry must have spiked after 9/11 and gotten really bad. That's not true. After 9/11, yes, there was an increase in sentiment, but most Americans did not report holding anti-Muslim views. You see here in October 2001, 47% positive, 39% negative. You jump forward 10 years, and it's gotten so much worse. 61% negative, 33% positive. 2015, 61% negative, 37% positive. And those numbers have adjusted in recent years, but they generally held that about 10 years after 9/11, anti-Muslim sentiment sparked. We suspect that's because of, number one, anti-Muslim bigotry being used in the 2010 election that led to the victory of the Tea Party, the so-called Ground Zero mosque fight, President Obama taking office and the anti-Muslim conspiracies about him. Obviously, then in 2014, you had ISIS and other terrorist attacks. You had Donald Trump harness anti-Muslim bigotry during his campaign. And that all brings us to the Muslim ban. So President Trump calls for a complete shutdown of Muslims in 2015. He then implements, obviously, a much scaled down version of this when he takes office a week after taking office in 2017. So that's a bit of the history, and now here we are. So after the president took office, after he implemented the Muslim ban, CARE noted from the time he took office to the present day, obviously an increasing surge in all sorts of anti-Muslim bias incidents, in particular, bias incidents involving government abuse, government discrimination. In 2017, between 2014 and 2019, we had over 2,000 acts of bias by the FBI, TSA, CBP that were reported to CARE, not in total, but just the things that were reported to CARE, which is not everything, obviously. We had a huge spike, obviously, in hate crimes that occurred before the president took office and after he took office. But in particular, I just want to note that we were able to very specifically note through CARE surveys and studies that government abuses directed at the Muslim community, government discrimination, significantly spiked after the Muslim ban was implemented. In New York alone, our New York chapter of CARE reported a 74% increase in all anti-Muslim bias incidents in 2017 alone, including a 660% increase in travel complaints coming into their office, and also a 314% increase in immigration cases and referrals they actually initiated. Again, 660% increase in travel-related complaints in 2017 alone. So the Muslim ban very specifically led to at least that form of discrimination, almost certainly contributed to the atmosphere that led to an increase in hate crimes. You see here hate crimes that we received reports of spiked from 2014 to 2017, started to taper off to 2019. And I just want to talk briefly about the human impact of the Muslim ban. So I dealt with multiple clients impacted by it. The first I want to note was a Syrian-American family north of Atlanta. They lived in Roswell. Husband was a chemical engineer. Wife was a teacher. The patriarch of the family, the grandfather, lived in Damascus. He had visited America a few times just to see his family and then gone back home. While he was in Damascus, he was diagnosed with a very aggressive form of eye cancer. It could not be treated in the Middle East. It could be treated in America, specifically at Emory University's hospital. He had the money to pay for the surgery. He was cleared to get the surgery, and he needed to get it by December of 2017. He applied for a medical visa to come to the United States. He was initially denied. This is before the Muslim ban had been completely upheld by the Supreme Court. They then called CARE for help. We helped them with the new application. We put some pressure on the government to give them approval, and we thought it was going to get approved. And while we were waiting, the Supreme Court upheld the Muslim ban temporarily. They lifted the injunction that allowed the Muslim ban to come into place while they waited to make a final decision about the case. So that allowed the Trump administration to simply bar him simply because he was Syrian, even though he's a 70-something-year-old man dying of cancer, clearly not a threat. So we went public with it. We threw a fit. We sought help from local politicians. Eventually, in January, the administration let him in. They gave him a waiver to the Muslim ban, but that was a month after the deadline, after the doctor said it could be too late. He came anyway. This is us at the airport. He got the surgery, and thank God it worked. It was successful. He was healed. That story had a happy ending. Not all stories did. Our CARE Sacramento office was working to help a family. There was a young boy, 2 years old, dying of a genetic condition. His mother was Yemeni, a Yemeni citizen, and therefore she was barred from coming back into the country to be with her family. And so the only thing CARE Sacramento was asking was that the administration let her come back to be with their son before he passed away. They tried privately, the administration refused. They went public, the administration still refused. The story, became very widely known, and eventually the administration did reverse course. She was able to come, and she was only able to spend literally days with her son before he passed away. May Allah comfort her and grant him paradise. So that story had a tragic ending. At least she got to see him, but it was a limited amount of time, again, because of this completely unnecessary ban that just barred everyone from coming. Even if you were obviously not a threat to anyone, you could not come. And the story was widely shared, and even that did not deter the administration from continuing to uphold the ban. So those are just a couple of examples of the human impact of the ban. So, now the question becomes, if Vice President Biden, President-elect Biden, lifts the ban as he's promised to do, what happens next? Where do we go from here? And I'll just briefly note that even if the Muslim ban goes away, it does not mean Islamophobia goes away by a long shot. In fact, one of my greatest fears is that with President Trump gone, anti-Muslim bigots might feel like they don't have a champion anymore and feel like they have to take matters into their own hands. So I'm hoping we don't see an increase in hate crimes and other acts of bigotry by private actors, but I'm also concerned that the Muslim ban will be lifted, but some of the other existing structures in government that target Muslims and Muslim immigrants will exist or return. We're hoping CVE does not come back again, obviously. We're hoping NCERS does not come back in any way, shape, or form. We're hoping that immigration officials will radically revamp the way Muslim travelers are treated when they're coming back into the country, especially Muslim citizens and Muslims coming here to go to school, get an education, come to work. Those are structural problems that have existed in our government before President Trump and will continue to exist after President Trump. unless radical change is made. And the last thing I want to note, my biggest concern is that because the Supreme Court upheld the Muslim ban, that really puts us in a weak position because even if Joe Biden lifts the Muslim ban, there is still now clearly constitutional precedent saying that the next president can reinstate the ban if he wants to, can do something like this, and can get away with saying all manner of anti-Muslim or anti-religious things, and an establishment clause case will still likely not be successful because we lost the Muslim ban case on establishment clause grounds and on statutory grounds. So the problem is that now we've got Supreme Court precedent that really gives presidents leeway to say all sorts of bigoted things and then implement bigoted policy. And then we've, of course, got Supreme Court precedent saying that the correct interpretation of existing law would allow something like this. And if we've got a split Congress, then the statutory law that allowed this is not going to be changed. Even if Joe Biden takes office and wants to do it, a Republican Senate likely won't let him pass the No Ban Act. All that is to say that everything that is needed to re-implement something like the Muslim ban is there, just waiting for the next president. So that's why it's so important that we change the law. Number one, the No Ban Act be passed so that the next president doesn't have the legal authority to do the statutory authority. And hopefully we convince the Supreme Court in some other case to reconsider the liberality it's granted political officials to engage in bigotry and then implement bigoted policies and escaping an establishment clause violation. So hopefully I didn't go too far over time. I wanted to cover all that. I'm going to wrap up now and happy to answer questions later.
Thank you, Edward. We're actually doing great on time, and thanks to you and the other speakers so far. I hope everyone's enjoying this program. I want to remind everyone that we're going to do questions and answers in the end, so please post any questions in the Q&A. I have noted a few already, so we'll get those to our speakers after our final speaker concludes her remarks. Our next speaker right now is Mehwish Shaukat, who's a litigation associate at O'Mulvaney and Myers San Francisco office. She maintains an active pro bono practice in asylum and prisoners' rights litigation. She was on a team recently representing a client for an excessive confinement case in the California Supreme Court. She's a founder of the Muslim Employee Group at her law firm and has completed her law degree at Northwestern University Law School and her undergraduate degree at Agnes Scott. She's externed with Judge Matthew Kennelly of the United States District Court of the Northern District of Illinois and is the author of American Muslim Women, Who We Are and What We Demand, from Feminist Jurisprudence in the Hastings Women's Law Journal. Mehwish, we look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you so much. And just want to briefly confirm, are you able to hear me well, Rola?
We hear you perfectly.
Okay, wonderful. So first, I want to thank the ABA and our amazing moderators for all of your efforts in putting together this panel. It's really an honor for me to be here today. So today I want to focus on two main points. I think to set the stage, I briefly want to touch on the broader implications of the Supreme Court's decision to uphold the Muslim ban. And then I want to talk about the treatment of American Muslim women, both in society generally and in relation to policing. So as Professor Saleema Snow mentioned earlier, interestingly, the best way to contextualize the historical and heavy stakes of the Supreme Court's decision to uphold the Muslim ban is to examine Justice Sotomayor's dissent. And Justice Sotomayor's dissent was joined by Justice Ginsburg. And in her dissent, Justice Sotomayor drew some really powerful parallels between the Muslim ban and Korematsu, which authorized the internment of Japanese Americans. And so I just wanted to read really just 2 or 3 lines from the opinion to kind of, set the stage a little bit further. So Justice Sotomayor wrote, "Today's holding is all the more troubling given the stark parallels between the reasoning of this case and that of Korematsu. As here, the government invoked an ill-defined national security threat to justify an exclusionary policy of sweeping proportion. And as here, there was strong evidence that impermissible hostility and animus motivated the government's policy. Our Constitution demands and our country deserves a judiciary willing to hold the coordinate branches to account when they defy our most sacred legal commitments. because the court's decision today has failed in that respect, with profound regret, I dissent. I think this excerpt really highlights that this decision was not plainly about statutory interpretation or about plenary power. It was about authorizing the wholesale discrimination of an entire religious group, a notion that squarely violates America's founding principles. So how have American Muslim women experienced Islamophobia after the Muslim ban? I think to answer this question, want to just give a few examples and contextualize this word, Islamophobia. Islamophobia is deeply entrenched in American political discourse and also within American jurisprudence. So Islamophobia, or the vilification and criminalization of the Muslim identity, is so pervasive that many Americans have just accepted that discriminating against Muslims is a necessary and inevitable consequence of living in a post 9/11 Trumpian world. And one particularly harmful feature of Islamophobia is the distortion and erasure of American Muslim women's identities. As it stands, third-party accounts really dominate the scholarship and public discourse on American Muslim women. We are the subjects of great fascination, and our identities are constructed and deconstructed and weaponized to suit third-party needs, but our voices are rarely ever heard. And when it comes to American political discourse, including after the Muslim ban, we're still spoken about, but rarely listened to. And so we exist in these extreme poles because these dramatic characterizations supply the best ammunition for third-party needs. We're either oppressed or we're heroes. And the storm of three events colliding. The first is Trump's inauguration, the second is the signing of the Muslim ban, and the third being the Women's March on Washington, really put American Muslim women on a bullet train from oppressed refugees to heroes. And I mean, don't get me wrong, it was definitely an upgrade, but it happened so fast that it really gave me and so many American Muslim women whiplash. The iconic photo of a hijabi wrapped in an American flag was plastered in posters and banners across the country and also in our nation's capital during the Women's March on Washington. Suddenly, we were the face of the resistance. But when you look to feminist legal theory, there was a huge disconnect between this outward symbolism and real, genuine inclusion within feminist jurisprudence. Even 3 years later, in 2020, if you take a look at textbooks on feminist jurisprudence and those that are taught in law schools across the country, including top law schools, the first entry in the index for Muslim women in one of these textbooks is rape of. So American Muslim women's representation at the Women's March, it was a moment of great significance, but it rings of tokenization and pageantry until we get to speak for ourselves and in an intersectional discourse to declare our identity and to set forth an agenda of issues that really matter to us. And so to take this thread a little further, what are some manifestations of Islamophobia that we've seen after the Muslim ban? And I can't do justice to what Edward mentioned earlier, so I won't even try. But I think just to summarize briefly, what we've seen is that American civil rights after 9/11 and beyond, including after the Muslim ban, is that the government uses these magic words like Muslim and hijab and national security security as these talismanic incantations to halt legal analysis before it begins. And so this practice has functionally created an implicit per se terrorist doctrine. American Muslim women, American Muslims at large are per se terror suspects for all legal encounters, like including random traffic violations. And so this doctrine has carved out an unparalleled legal discretionary zone that really it profoundly impacts the way that governmental actors, including the police, treat American Muslim women. And it's within this very murky, and often violent discretionary zone that police officers routinely violate the religious liberties of hijabis. And so the one issue I want to focus on today briefly is really just the police officers forcibly removing hijab of Muslim women in booking photos. So many incidents have been reported across the country, from Atlanta to New York to LA. And these direct attacks on the bodies and constitutional liberties of American Muslim women can be seen as a consequence of the Muslim ban's state-sanctioned animus against an entire religious community. One example was in 2018, 3 American Muslim women, actually sued the city of New York for forcibly removing their hijabs and booking photos. Because these claims were so egregious, they eventually reached a settlement where each woman was paid $60,000. Another example was in the city of Portland. A handful of American Muslim women were arrested. I think about 2 of them were forced to remove their hijabs in their booking photos. And then these photographs of them without their hijabs were released to the public. In this case, the sheriff actually issued a public apology, and he said that his police officers were ill prepared for these types of arrests. And there's really too many more stories to cover in this short period of time. And but I think I want to just take a moment to discuss a few more details of this example. This was a group of Black Muslim women who wear hijab, who were peacefully attending a Black Lives Matter protest. And as Professor Saleema Snow and Edward and Ashraf and our panelists have mentioned, I mean, American Muslims are one of the most intersectional groups in this country. And Black Muslims, who were the first Muslims in this country, who are the founding members of our community, are indisputably at the intersection of the most criminal identities in America. And we can't move forward as a nation until we reckon with and acknowledge our role in upholding these structures that subjugate and murder our Black sisters and brothers. And I really just don't think that we can even have a conversation about Islamophobia without acknowledging and discussing the rampant racism that's within the Muslim community, because I think that it's really the height of hypocrisy to seek justice with one hand and to do harm with the other. And we really need, in this moment in 2020, and really for many years before, we need the South Asians and the Arabs and other Muslim demographics to really stand up and demand justice for every Black life, not just the Muslim ones. And I think just to close, I feel like it's important to say that as lawyers, it is our imperative to keep striving for a country that we can be proud of, and we cannot get there until every Black life matters.
Thank you so much, Mehwish. Those excellent remarks. And again, thanks to all of our panelists and everybody. I'll remind everyone that we can put questions in the Q&A, and we've got one more speaker, and hopefully we'll get to our questions. Our final speaker today is Engy Abdelkader, who's a fellow at the Public Religion Research Institute and German Marshall Fund of the US. Her teaching and research explore religion, race, and gender at the intersection of law, politics, and society. Her many scholarly publications include When Islamophobia Turns Violent, Immigration in the Era of Trump, and Muslims and Islam in US Public Schools. Her writings have appeared in numerous places, including CNN, HuffPost, Time, Christian Science Monitor. She's also a dedicated public servant. She's collaborated with the United States and the US State Department, among others, and she holds 2 US law degrees, including credentials from the University of Pennsylvania Law School. Ms. Abdelkader is going to close out our panel today, so we look forward to hearing her remarks.
Thank you so much. So good afternoon, everybody. First, I want to express my gratitude to both Rula and Nadia Ahmed, who invited me to be part of this conversation today. And I also want to express thanks for the American Bar Association for providing this platform, as well as to the co-sponsors, the National Association of Muslim Lawyers, as well as CARE, for lending their support. This is a really important conversation, as some of my panelists have highlighted, a critical political, social, and historical moment. And so I'm honored to be a part of it. What I'd like to do, actually, for purposes of my presentation, I realize that the time is limited, is draw on scholarship that I published several months ago with NYU School of Law. And that particular law review article is titled Immigration in the Era of Trump. And the title is somewhat misleading insofar as the article actually does not discuss immigration law at all. It provides an interdisciplinary analysis of the impact of xenophobia on socially oppressed groups and not simply immigrants. It engages in a relevant constitutional analysis while highlighting the adverse impact of that xenophobia on a nation as a whole. And so what I'd like to do is just take a step back and make several points. And the first point is that while this panel has so far focused on Islamophobia and specifically a particular manifestation or a culmination of Islamophobia in an American context, which is the Muslim ban, I think it's important to realize that the Muslim ban is also a specific layer of xenophobia, right? That this type of Islamophobia that we're discussing is actually reflective of a greater phenomenon of xenophobia that exists within the United States, and to sort of contextualize it in that manner. And there's a number of reasons why that's important, which is that at that point, we realized that this phenomena of xenophobia is not only adversely impacting Muslims in the United States and beyond, but also other immigrant populations as well as socially oppressed groups. So let me discuss that as a preliminary matter. I mean, we've heard from a number of my colleagues about the impact of both candidate Trump's presidential campaign in 2016 during the 2016 presidential election cycle, as well as some of the consequences of his ascension to the Oval Office and the policies enacted thereafter. And it's important to note that according to academic research, it's actually a long established fact that both political discourse as well as political events and policies can in fact play a contributing role to the frequency of bias-based incidents. So when you hear various socially oppressed groups say that there's a negative consequence to the Islamophobic or xenophobic or racist rhetoric that elected officials, including our current president, Trump, engages in, that's not really a matter of perception, it's a matter of documented academic research. And in fact, in the last several years, there's been an abundance of academic research studies that has been published by political scientists and sociologists and others that in fact demonstrate this positive relationship between xenophobic, Islamophobic, and racist rhetoric and policies, and the increased incidence of bias-based discrimination against socially oppressed groups. So first, let's briefly look at the Muslim American group, which my colleagues, I think, have thoroughly examined in their remarks. But during the 2016 presidential election cycle, according to research, Muslim Americans, or those perceived to be, were 3 to 5 times more likely to be victimized by acts or threats of violence. And this was in fact directly correlated with the Islamophobic rhetoric and policies that were advanced by then candidate Trump. And specifically, you know, we've heard about the Muslim ban and the key campaign promise for a complete and total shutdown on Muslims into the United States. But some of the other policies that Trump promised on a campaign trail was the warrantless surveillance of mosques, a Muslim registry. And as we already heard, he also went on CNN and claimed that Islam hates us. And with each, you know, inflammatory statement directed at this particularly socially oppressed religious minority, there came increased bias incidents, whether in the context of employment or in school or in the public square. And that's important to highlight. Obviously, after his ascension to the Oval Office, he in fact executed an order banning immigrants from 7 Muslim majority countries. And according to various advocacy groups, there was in fact increased bias following that executive order. And perhaps most importantly, there was actually a study that showed that after Trump's ascension to the Oval Office, 1 out of 5 hate incidents of hate violence directed at Muslims, Arabs, or South Asians specifically referenced Trump, a Trump slogan, or a Trump policy. And in my view, I think that's actually very credible evidence of the relationship between discriminatory rhetoric, policies, and the lived experiences of Muslim Americans in this country. But significantly, obviously this is all sort of familiar because my esteemed panelists have already highlighted it in the context of their remarks, but significantly, Muslim Americans aren't the only socially oppressed group that experience increased frequency of bias incidents as a result of President Trump's discriminatory or inflammatory rhetoric and policies. Specifically, I'm thinking of the Latinx and African immigrant communities who also suffered institutionalized and interpersonal discrimination connected to the rhetoric and policies coming from the Oval Office. President Trump, both as a candidate and as the most powerful man arguably in the world, employed regularly divisive rhetoric that debased and dehumanized both the Latinx and African immigrant community. Specifically, he referred, in fact, he launched his campaign back in 2015 on a xenophobic platform that characterized Latino immigrants as criminals, as rapists, and subsequently also as animals. Once in the Oval Office, he specifically referred to African countries, excuse my language, as quote unquote shithole countries, while expressing a preference for immigration from European countries such as Norway. And again, thinking back and considering that long-established principle in academic literature that political events and political discourse does in fact contribute to the frequency of bias, discrimination, bias incidents. What we saw in the Hispanic community, for instance, is a 50% increase in hate crimes since 2016. So the Latino community since 2016 has experienced a 50% increase in hate crimes, and Latino leaders and advocacy groups attribute that directly to this inflammatory rhetoric, to the xenophobic policies that have been enacted, such as, for example, the border wall at the southern border, which I will speak to momentarily. In addition, the African American community, according to the most recent analysis from the FBI regarding the incidence of hate crimes, actually accounts for 47% of all race-based hate crimes in the United States, notwithstanding the fact that they only constitute 13% of the whole population. So 13% of our population is experiencing about half of all race-based hate crimes in the country. And significantly, the NAACP similarly attributes this disproportionate level of violence that this racial minority group is experiencing to President Trump's rhetoric and policy decisions. Now, interestingly, another socially oppressed group and historically marginalized group that has also bore the brunt of xenophobic political rhetoric and policies, in addition to Latinos, in addition to African Americans, in addition to Muslim Americans, is actually Jewish Americans. And I think it's interesting because we don't typically associate Jewish Americans with the immigrant populations. Although, you know, there are Jews who were actually present in the United States at the time of its founding. Many Jews arrived in the United States as refugees and immigrants. But today, Jews are actually one of the most affluent and integrated communities in the country. And yet, during the last 4 years, we saw that they too also suffered adverse implications from the xenophobic policies and rhetoric of President Trump. While they constitute about 2 to 3% of the population, they saw a rise in hate crimes. About over 50% of religiously based hate crimes are anti-Semitic in nature and are directed at Jewish Americans. Specifically, we saw one of the worst, or the worst, what's been characterized as the worst anti-Semitic incident of mass violence, the mass shooting at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh that occurred by a white genocide conspiracy theorist. And what's interesting about that particular crime is that prior to the attack, he explained that he was targeting Jews because of the work of organizations such as HIAS. And HIAS, for those of you who may not be familiar with that particular advocacy group, is the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society. And they are devoted to helping refugees and immigrants come into the United States and settle and make a new life here, including Muslims. And specifically, this particular attacker blamed Jews for bringing in evil, filthy, quote unquote, Muslims into the country. And so in this way, we also see the adverse impact of xenophobia, the xenophobic language, xenophobic policies on another socially oppressed group. Which brings me to my second point. I've highlighted the fact that the Muslim ban is really a layer of xenophobia, a larger, broader phenomena confronting the country and sort of situating it in that respect. And that xenophobia has not only impacted immigrants, but other socially oppressed groups in the country. And one of the revelations that I've had over the last 4 years is how these ideologies of oppression, the anti-Black racism, the anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and xenophobia are actually intersecting and interlocking and overlapping while still remaining distinct, right? And so let me give you some examples of what I'm referring to. First, what many people may not realize is that back during the initial campaign cycle, President Trump's campaign cycle in 2015 and 2016, the first hate crime that was actually inspired by his rhetoric involved 2 brothers who attacked a homeless Latino man in Boston, Massachusetts. And after they were arrested and interrogated by the reporting police officers, they confessed that they had in fact been inspired by Trump's anti-immigrant rhetoric. And they had targeted this homeless Latino man for that specific reason, right? So there you go. There's your credible evidence about the positive relationship between this irresponsible, inflammatory, discriminatory, biased rhetoric, not to mention subsequent policies, and the impact it has on the lived experiences of socially oppressed groups. But here's what's even more interesting. These same brothers who were arrested and convicted of committing this hate crime against this homeless Latino man were previously convicted of perpetrating a hate crime in the post-September 11th context against Muslims and Arabs. So in this way, we see oftentimes when we speak of intersectionality, we emphasize and focus almost exclusively, and this is largely due to Professor Kimberly Crenshaw's theory of intersectionality, which she advanced decades ago, back in the 1990s, and only I think largely because of the Women's March, it's now a concept with which many of us are now familiar with. We think of intersectionality in terms of individual identities and how different aspects of people's social and political identities intersect and inform their experiences, including experiences with discrimination and bias. But here, what I'm actually emphasizing is the intersectionality of ideologies of oppression. And so we see this manifest in interpersonal in an interpersonal context where these brothers who attacked a Latino man were previously implicated in attack against Muslims and Arabs as well in the post-September 11th context. Here's my second example. I mentioned to you the Tree of Life mass shooting in Pittsburgh. And there we also saw the intersectionality of ideologies of oppression. Specifically, the perpetrator of that attack, as I mentioned, not only cited his hostility towards Jews, but that hostility was connected to the fact that they were perceived as helping, quote unquote, dirty, filthy, evil Muslim invaders into our country. And so in that respect, you see this intersection of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia that culminates in mass violence, right? The third example is one that one of my colleagues already highlighted, which is how the Muslim ban, when we saw its expansion earlier this year, it actually also reflected anti-Black racism, right? What was initially conceived and perceived as exclusively targeting a Muslim majority population or subject, in fact, expanded and now encompass 4 African nations. And so we now commonly refer to it as both a Muslim and African ban. And so again, you see this intersectionality in terms of ideologies of oppression. And that's important in my view for a number of different reasons. First, I think it's important for purposes of building solidarity among socially oppressed groups, and realizing that while each of these phenomena, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, anti-Black racism, and so forth, are in fact distinct. They have distinct histories, they may manifest in distinct ways, so on and so. There are also overlapping and intersecting, which brings me to the next point, which is this realization that anytime an injustice, anytime inequality manifests itself, it in fact sets a negative precedent for that same type of injustices and inequalities to manifest against other socially oppressed groups, right? So initially we saw the manifestation of the Muslim ban, and we thought, well, this seems to be like a Muslim problem, right? It's directed against real or perceived Muslims. But then it expanded and also encompassed African immigrants as well. Similarly, if you think about the rhetoric that we've heard over the last 6 months or so in the context of the pandemic, targeting or directed at members of the Asian American population or Asians, the Wuhan virus, the Kung flu. To me, because I've studied Islamophobia and written about Islamophobia for so long and so familiar with the Islamophobic political rhetoric that the same individual has regularly engaged in to scapegoat, demonize, and dehumanize Muslim Americans, when I heard this rhetoric directed at Asian Americans, it seemed so familiar to me because there was already a precedent for it. The precedent when he attacked Latinos because as criminals and rapists and invaders, when he attacked Muslims as Islamic extremists and terrorists, when he attacks African nations as shithole countries. It should not come as a surprise that he then attacks Asians and scapegoats them for a pandemic rather than trying to innovate and come up with some real solutions to managing a public health crisis. And then lastly, the focus here has been on the impact, the impact of xenophobia on Muslims or on specific socially oppressed groups. And now, the second point that I'm making is how these ideologies of oppression are actually intersecting and overlapping while still remaining distinct. And I think it's important to realize that all of this also has an adverse impact on a nation as a whole. So this isn't just a Muslim problem. It's not just a problem for minority or marginalized groups. It's also a problem for our nation as a whole. So how so? Well, let me take a moment to just highlight how xenophobia manifested itself besides the Muslim ban, how it manifested itself in policy. And specifically, I'm referring here to the border wall. So much like Trump promised America and voters a Muslim ban if he ascended to office, he also promised a barrier wall at the southern border that would keep the criminals and the rapists and the traffickers out of the country. And on the campaign trail, he also claimed that Mexico would pay for this wall. Well, in reality, after he ascended to the Oval Office, he attempted to make good on that campaign promise, but he needed money from Congress in order to make it happen. And he was requesting specifically about $5.6 billion from Congress, and the House of Representatives was only willing to give him $1.3 billion to build this wall. And during the negotiation process, President Trump regularly threatened to use his emergency powers under the National Emergency Act of 1976, because by declaring a national emergency at the southern border, he would actually have access to specific funds that would he previously did not have access to, right? So he would circumvent Congress's power of the purse as set forth in the Constitution. He would use this law from 1976, declare a national emergency that would give him more, billions and billions of more dollars to build the desired wall. And eventually that's actually what he did. So he organized held a press conference in the Rose Garden. At that conference, he said, I didn't have to do this, but I've been left with no choice. I'm declaring a national emergency pursuant to this act from 1976. And significantly, that act actually, unfortunately, has no definition of what actually constitutes a national emergency. It leaves it completely within the discretion of the president to determine when it's appropriate to declare a national emergency. And so there was a firestorm of controversy after President Trump did this. He declared a national emergency at the southern border, even though crossings at the southern border, according to government data, has actually the lowest it has ever been in decades. But he said that there was a national emergency so that way he could get more money to build his wall. How is this relevant? Well, it's relevant because essentially the president declared what many consider to be a fake national emergency. It's grounded in xenophobia. It's contextualized in pretext, right? And essentially it sets a negative precedent, not only for this particular administration, not only for the next administration, but for administrations to come in 10, 20 years. And there's a really frightening prospect in terms of what can then happen if there's not appropriate legislative reform to the National Emergencies Act, which brings me back to the larger subject of this panel, which is Islamophobia. So why am I mentioning this? Because if the president can declare a quote unquote fake national emergency to build a wall on the southern border, he can also declare a quote unquote fake national emergency in response to a terrorist attack perpetrated by real or perceived Muslims. He can also declare a quote unquote fake national emergency to quell what he sees as a disturbance of law and order, but is just a demand for racial equality and social justice. He can also declare a quote unquote fake national emergency in the context of a public health crisis in order to contain a scapegoated, marginalized community. And looking into the future, I mean, we would be like, well, that's why so many Americans voted this president out, which is a relief. But by the same token, we also know that a precedent has now been set. The infrastructure is now there for other leaders of the free world to do the same, right? Not just even only in America, but just globally, because America as a hegemon sets an example for the world over, right? And so in this way, I think I'm trying to make the point that, we don't lose too much sleep about that national emergency that was declared to build a border wall. And we may not necessarily see its impact in the lives of Muslim Americans, but it may eventually materialize in that respect, not only for Muslim Americans, but other marginalized groups. And in that way, I think there is an adverse impact for the nation as a whole, and why we need to be invested in fighting inequality, irrespective of how it manifests or who it's targeted against, because it's an issue that affects all of us. So thank you so much, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Engy, and thanks again to each of our panelists. This has been such an interesting discussion and really beneficial to all of us listening to hear from each of your various perspectives that you bring to this topic. I'm recognizing time, and we have a number of excellent questions. So I've asked our panelists, to the extent they can, to type in and respond answers to some of the questions. I will, though, it looked like there were a few questions that were along the same line, and that was to the panelists, and maybe I'll start with Professor Snow for this one. There has been a lot of momentum with regard to the discriminatory policies that have taken place under the Trump administration. And there are some who are concerned that that momentum may not be there if there are concerning discriminatory policies to communities under the Biden administration. So what are your thoughts about how we may address that?
So if I'm understanding the question correctly, I mean, President-elect Biden has promised to repeal the Muslim ban the first day in office. I'm hoping that that will happen. But I also think that the No Ban Act, which I believe CARE, I know Muslim advocates has been at the forefront of that, that he will, as a president, will also support getting bipartisan, advocate to get bipartisan support for that legislation so that we aren't seeing ourselves repeating, but much more fundamentally, beginning to decriminalize deportation, removal proceedings, beginning to stop implementing the unfettered action against removal of Somali immigrants. So it's someone, posted it on social media that now we're back to regular racism. So I do think that while we are excited about the possibilities moving forward, that we do not have everything is not our utopia. We still have to use coalition building. We still have to, support our civil rights organizations that are on the ground doing this work, such as CARE, Muslim Advocates. So the work continues in many ways, but those are two very, very specific things that our expectation is that President Biden will immediately do. And again, repealing the Muslim ban and working to get bipartisan support for the No Ban Act.
Thank you. We also have a question that references that the panelists so well identified that there are many other manifestations of targeting and demonizing Muslims outside of the Muslim ban. Could each of you share, maybe in a moment or so, your thoughts about the top things that we should be aware of and advocate to change?
I'll go briefly on the topic of, since we're talking about the Muslim ban, which is an immigration issue to some extent, one thing that persists that I'd love to see change is the way Muslim travelers are treated coming into the country. So I'd love to see some regulations saying, number one, that obviously border officials can no longer forcibly take people's cell phones from them without a warrant or force them to unlock their phones. It happens usually to Muslims. Number two, that before any sort of interview occurs, the person doing the interview has to identify themselves and provide the interview subject something in writing identifying the name of that agent, the time of the interview and all that. So we have some written documentation of who's doing this so we can hold them accountable later if they abuse individuals or traveling. And then of course, I'd love to see Homeland Security, invest in doing some very detailed studies of who's being stopped, their religion, their ethnicity, how often, and obviously not to mention the watch list and all that thing that CARE is fighting in the courts right now. But those are some things that I'd love to see change in simple regulations in terms of travelers.
Thank you, Edward. Anybody else from our panel would like to address that question before we close?
Just briefly, if I may, this is Ashraf. Can you hear me?
Sure, we can hear you.
Yes. I think that one group maybe that I think that we should engage more is the Christian right, because a lot of the anti-Muslim bigotry comes from those quarters, and it's not necessarily the parishioners; it's the pastors who are putting out this information. And so I think engaging with that community through their leaders, obviously, and through neighbors and so forth. But that's just one of the top 5, I think, of things that we can do in addition to the other things that are mentioned. But definitely with policymakers. And it starts with the changing of the laws. If you change the laws, then you have an opportunity to build on that.
Thank you, Ashraf. Well, I believe we are out of time, unfortunately. I know that there's a number of questions left, but we had such a benefit of having these esteemed panel members speaking on these issues from their perspectives. I will share that my colleague, Nadia Ahmed, who helped put this together, has shared her email address NAHMAD at Barry, BARRY.edu for anyone who's interested in getting involved with the ABA, learning about more opportunities, and encouraging also law students to get involved. I want to thank you all for joining this webinar and also express our deep gratitude to this esteemed group of panelists. You all are doing such critical work in our communities, and we thank you for taking the time out of your clearly very busy schedules to share your knowledge, your research and experiences with all of us. Many thanks to my colleague Nadia Ahmed and our ABA staff for their work in bringing this program together. The ABA section of Civil Rights and Social Justice provides a number of free webinars and resources for legal professionals and advocates nationwide. We hope that this helps you in your work, and we hope that you will consider joining and becoming active with the American Bar Association. You can find more information on our programs on the CRSJ website. And many thanks again to our panelists. Best of luck to everyone in your work, and please stay